Another 100 million XRP just vanished from the open market, and almost nobody is talking about what that really means. Today, 21 Shares officially launched its spot XRP ETF, and it didn't launch empty. It launched already seeded with roughly 100 million XRP, quietly pulled out of circulation before most retail investors even realized the product was live. Let that sink in for a second. This isn't speculation. This isn't hype. This is real XRP being locked up inside regulated financial products, reducing liquid supply while demand infrastructure continues to build. And the language 21 Shares used should make anyone paying attention pause. They called it a foundational asset in the future of global payments. That's not retail talking. That's institutions planting flags. Now here's where this gets serious and where most people miss the opportunity. With the right guidance and knowledge, most losses in crypto wouldn't have been losses at all. They could have turned into smarter decisions that compounded into 5 times or even 10 times wins over time. The real difference between people who panic and people who build real wealth is investing in themselves early, before the crowd understands what's happening. That's exactly why I built XRP Insiders Elite. Inside, you get exclusive XRP Insider reports, institutional-grade insights, the same millionaire mindset and investor frameworks used by top 1% crypto investors, and full access to premium wealth resources, all bundled in one place. If you're serious about positioning yourself before institutional capital fully arrives, the XRP Insiders Elite is linked in the pinned comment. This is where preparation turns into generational wealth. Back to what's unfolding right now. 21 Shares didn't just file paperwork. They launched, and they launched with conviction. Nearly 98.36 million XRP seeded on day one means this wasn't a test balloon, it was execution. Every spot ETF needs inventory, and inventory means real tokens removed from open circulation. Multiply this by Franklin Templeton, Bitwise, Gayscale, Canary, Rex Osprey, and now 21 Shares, and suddenly you're not talking about theoretical demand anymore. You're talking about sustained structural supply pressure, and that's before the biggest players even step in. Ask yourself a simple question. If smaller issuers are comfortable seeding XRP ETFs with close to 100 million XRP each, what happens when BlackRock K decides it's time? What does BlackRock K seed with? 300 million, 500 million, a billion, and they won't move until client demand forces their hand. But here's the key detail most people overlook. Vanguard has already opened the door. When conservative capital platforms begin allowing exposure, that's usually the signal that the next wave is already being prepared behind the scenes. Zoom out even further. The total XRP ETF market right now is roughly $1.6 billion. Bitcoin ETFs around $125 billion. Ethereum about $22 billion. XRP doesn't need to flip Bitcoin to radically reprick. It just needs to close a fraction of that gap. A move toward Bitcoin level allocation would mathematically imply a 100 times expansion from where XRP ETFs sit today. That doesn't happen overnight, but it also doesn't happen randomly. It happens step by step, product by product, seed by seed, exactly like what we're watching now. And the volume confirms it. Over 4 million XRP traded in just 15 minutes after market open. That's not retail frenzy. That's liquidity being tested, pipelines being opened, and systems being stress tested for larger flows. Institutions don't rush. They probe, measure, and scale. This is probing. At the same time, TRDFI is having a realization it can't avoid anymore. As Uphold's CEO recently put it, traditional finance doesn't need to own the future of on-chain finance, but it absolutely needs to plug into it. And now for the first time, regulation, technology, and customer demand are aligning simultaneously. Banks that once took years to experiment are now being onboarded to on-chain rails in 90 days. That's not evolution, that's acceleration. Why the rush? Because the biggest wealth transfer in human history is underway. Over $80 trillion is expected to move from older generations to younger ones over the next 2 decades. And younger investors don't think in terms of legacy rails, they think in terms of speed, transparency, and digital native systems. Institutions that fail to adapt won't just lose market share, they'll lose relevance. This is why XRP matters in this conversation. The XRP ledger wasn't built yesterday. It's been operating since 2012, designed for real-world payments, real settlement, and real scale. Tokenization, DeFi, global payments. These aren't experiments on XRPL, they're active use cases. And as more stable coins like RLUSD integrate directly onto the ledger, liquidity deepens, routing improves, and the network becomes harder to ignore. All of this is happening while supply quietly tightens and infrastructure quietly locks in place. And we're not even at the loud part yet, the part where retirement accounts, 401ks, and long-term allocators begin stepping in. That door is starting to open too, and once it does, the conversation around XRP changes permanently. And this is where the picture widens, because what's happening with XRP right now isn't isolated to one ETF launch or one issuer pulling supply off the market. It's happening across the entire financial stack at the same time. You have product approval, liquidity formation, regulatory alignment, macro tailwinds, and generational demand all converging into a single window. That's rare. And when that happens, markets don't move linearly, they re-prick. One of the most important signals people gloss over is how quietly fast institutions are moving once the green light appears. For years, banks and asset managers used regulation as the excuse for staying on the sidelines. Now that excuse is gone. We're seeing it in real time. Over 1,000 institutional leads from a single TradFi on-chain summit. Major exchanges integrating XRP native rails. Stable coins choosing XRPL for settlement instead of slower, more expensive alternatives. These aren't experiments anymore. They're infrastructure decisions. Take RLUSD expanding onto the XRP ledger through Gemini. On the surface, it sounds like just another stable coin integration. In reality, it's a structural upgrade. Near instant settlement, ultra-low fees, direct routing through XRP's native liquidity mechanics. Every RLUSD transaction that moves on XRPL increases network activity, strengthens liquidity pools, and reinforces XRP's role as the connective tissue of value transfer. Liquidity isn't a buzzword. It's the oxygen of global finance. You cannot move trillions per day without deep, efficient liquidity. And that's exactly what XRP was designed to solve. This is also where the misunderstanding around ownership versus access comes in. Traditional finance doesn't need to own blockchains to benefit from them. It needs access, integration, and reliability. The same way banks didn't own the internet, but had to build on top of it or get left behind. That mid-90s comparison isn't exaggeration. It's accurate. Once the internet crossed from novelty to necessity, adoption compressed into a few short years. Blockchain is crossing that threshold. Now, zooming out to the macro environment makes this even clearer. Markets don't exist in a vacuum. They move with the business cycle. And right now, the business cycle is turning up. Liquidity conditions are set to loosen. Fiscal stimulus is lining up, and political incentives favor growth over restraint. Historically, when liquidity floods the system, capital flows out the risk curve. First equities, then smaller caps, then alternative assets, and eventually crypto and altcoins. This is why the alt season is dead narrative never made sense. It wasn't dead, it was delayed. When earnings grow and credit expands, risk appetite returns. That's not opinion, that's how capital markets have always functioned. XRP doesn't need speculation to survive that environment. It benefits directly from it because it sits at the intersection of finance, payments, and infrastructure. It's not just another token hoping for rotation. It's embedded in the rails institutions are actively testing. Now, layer elections on top of that. 2026 is a major political year, and history shows us that governments tend to stimulate aggressively heading into midterms. Credit creation increases, spending ramps up, markets respond. That liquidity doesn't just disappear, it looks for returns. And as regulatory clarity continues to improve, crypto becomes an increasingly acceptable destination for that capital, especially assets that already have compliance frameworks, enterprise relationships, and live use cases. This is where XRP quietly separates itself from most of the market. While others are still pitching narratives, XRP is executing integrations. While others are debating regulation, XRP is operating within it. While others chase hype cycles, XRP is being embedded into payment flows, exchange settlement, and institutional products. That difference matters more than price action in the short term, and supply dynamics amplify everything. XRP isn't inflationary in the way many people assume. With each new ETF, custody product, or institutional rail, more XRP gets locked away. Less float, less available liquidity, more sensitivity to demand spikes. That's exactly how pressure builds under the surface without headlines screaming about it until suddenly price has to adjust to reflect reality. We're already seeing early signs of that adjustment in volume behavior, short bursts of high activity, rapid settlement, growing depth across trading pairs. These are mechanical signals, not emotional ones. Markets telegraph structural change before they reflect it in price. Then there's the retirement angle, which may be the biggest sleeping giant of all. What's happening right now isn't loud or flashy, but it's foundational. The push to allow Bitcoin and crypto exposure inside 401ks and other retirement accounts always begins cautiously. Bitcoin first, limited access, strict guardrails. That's how institutions move. But once the framework exists, it doesn't get reversed, it expands. Trillions of dollars are locked inside retirement vehicles. Even a 1 to 2% allocation into digital assets creates demand that dwarfs retail speculation. This isn't about traders chasing volatility. It's about long-term capital-seeking assets that can survive decades of monetary change. When retirement funds step in, the time horizon shifts from months to generations. What's especially important is that XRP is increasingly mentioned alongside Bitcoin in these conversations. That's not accidental. Bitcoin represents digital scarcity. XRP represents global payments, liquidity, and settlement infrastructure. Those are two very different functions, and both are essential to a modern financial system. Retirement capital doesn't chase hype, it allocates to relevance. Being positioned in the same regulatory and institutional discussions as Bitcoin signals recognition that XRP isn't a side experiment, it's part of the plumbing. Once retirement money gains access, the demand curve fundamentally changes, and the market never looks the same again. What makes this moment especially powerful is timing. XRP spent years in regulatory limbo, while infrastructure quietly matured. Now, as clarity emerges that infrastructure is already built, the rails are live, the partners are onboarded, the products are launching. This isn't the beginning, it's the acceleration phase, and as more capital, more products, and more institutions plug into these rails, the question stops being if XRP plays a central role and starts becoming how much of it is left when the rest of the world finally realizes what's already been set in motion. This is not financial advice. Once a system starts reinforcing itself, momentum no longer comes from speculation. It comes from necessity. Liquidity attracts liquidity. Usage attracts more usage. Products create demand, and demand justifies more products. That loop is beginning to form around XRP, and it's forming at the institutional level, not just on crypto Twitter. Look at how fast narratives shift once capital commits. The moment ETFs hold real inventory, custodians step in. When custodians step in, compliance frameworks tighten. When compliance tightens, retirement platforms and large allocators get comfortable. And when those players move, price becomes a consequence, not the objective. This is how Bitcoin crossed its own threshold, not through hype, but through legitimacy, custody, and regulated access. XRP is now walking that same path, only with a payments use case baked directly into its core. What makes this cycle different from previous ones is that XRP doesn't rely on belief alone. It relies on throughput, speed, cost efficiency, and interoperability. These aren't marketing terms, they're engineering constraints. Global finance cares about finality, uptime, and liquidity far more than narratives. The XRP ledger settles in seconds, costs fractions of a cent, and has been doing so reliably for over a decade. That matters when you're moving billions, not memes. As stablecoins like RLUSD scale on XRPPL, something subtle but powerful happens. XRP becomes the silent utility underneath value movement. Even when users don't see XRP, it's doing the routing, the pathfinding, the liquidity balancing. That's how infrastructure wins invisibly. The internet didn't become valuable because people talked about TCP/IP. It became valuable because everything depended on it. XRP is positioning itself the same way. This also explains why supply dynamics are so critical. Infrastructure assets don't need scarcity narratives. Scarcity emerges naturally when usage scales. Every ETF, every treasury allocation, every settlement rail locks up more supply. Over time, the available float shrinks while transactional demand increases. That's when markets are forced to reprick, not because of excitement, but because of math. And the math becomes unavoidable when capital inflows accelerate. If retirement accounts, pensions, and long-duration funds begin allocating even modest percentages to crypto infrastructure assets, the numbers get large very quickly. Trillions don't move delicately. They require deep liquidity and reliable rails. That's exactly the environment XRP was built for. This isn't about replacing Bitcoin or Ethereum. It's about complementing them in a financial system that needs different tools for different functions. Another overlooked factor is geographic neutrality. XRP isn't tied to a single nation's payment system. It's built for cross-border value transfer, which becomes increasingly important in a fragmented global economy. As regions experiment with digital currencies, tokenized assets, and new settlement layers, interoperability becomes the real prize. Systems that can't talk to each other don't scale globally. XRP's design philosophy anticipated this long before it became a mainstream concern. We're also seeing a generational mindset shift. Younger investors don't separate technology from finance. To them, it's the same thing. They expect real-time settlement, low fees, and digital native experiences. Institutions that want access to that future customer base have no choice but to adapt. Blockchain connectivity isn't optional anymore. It's table stakes. And once firms make that leap, they rarely go backwards. This is why the next phase won't feel explosive at first. It will feel quiet, methodical, almost boring. More filings, more integrations, more back-end upgrades, and then suddenly, one day, the market will realize that XRP isn't a speculative asset waiting for permission. It's a financial primitive already embedded in the system. By the time headlines catch up, positioning will already be done. The people who understood the infrastructure phase will be sitting on assets that institutions now need, not just want. That's how asymmetric opportunities are created, not through noise, but through preparation. And preparation is the real edge. Information alone isn't enough. Context matters. Timing matters. Discipline matters. The difference between reacting to the market and anticipating it is education and framework. That's why so many people buy late, sell early, and repeat the cycle. Not because they're wrong about the technology, but because they never built the conviction to hold through uncertainty. That's exactly what XRP Insider's Elite was created to solve. Inside, you get exclusive XRP Insider reports, deep dive research, proven investor frameworks, and a long-term wealth mindset designed for building generational capital. If you're serious about positioning yourself ahead of what's coming, not after it's obvious, this is your opportunity to invest in yourself first. Most people wait for confirmation. The few who prepare early are the ones who benefit when the shift finally becomes undeniable. You'll find XRP Insider's Elite linked in the pinned comment in the pinned. The financial system is changing whether people are ready or not. Liquidity is moving. Infrastructure is locking in. Supply is tightening. And XRP is quietly becoming harder to ignore by the institutions that matter most. The question now isn't whether this transformation happens. It's whether you positioned yourself early enough to take full advantage of